We are here at the Innovation Zero Conference Day 2, and I am here with Baroness Bryony Worthington, a key architect of the groundbreaking Climate Change Act in the UK. Now, Bryony, tell us a little bit about what you're up to just now, because, your work spans, huge amounts of technology, energy, politics, etc. So tell us more.
So I am currently co-chair of this event. So I opened up the proceedings this morning with a few remarks, but I am currently living in California. So I'm living this dual life where my heart is still here. This is still my home, and I'm following from afar what's happening. But I'm now also in California, which gives me a completely new perspective on the climate change issue. And of course, here we are, April 25. Things have got a little bit complex, shall we say, in the US. So so that's where I'm at the moment. I'm doing a kind of portfolio of things, mixing. Well, one thing I am doing is podcasting. So it gives me an opportunity to speak to brilliant people and produce content, which, that's great fun, right? So I'm doing that. I'm working in academia a little bit, and I've got a range of people that I sit on the board of. And I'm still involved in EMBA, which was my baby NGO that I started. So, yeah.
And they're doing amazing things. And it really kind of takes us into the conversation about where the politics on net zero and energy is at globally, and where the reality of the energy transition is. EMBA's doing a lot of work on that, and so are you. Could you give us a perspective, as someone who's now based in California but has your roots here in the UK, on what is going on either side of the pond and how you see the reverberations of this globally?
Right. So what's happening is there's a kind of disconnect between the kind of narrative and performative nature of politics and then what's happening on the ground. And what's been great with working with EMBA is that they go back to the data. And they just published a global electricity review, which showed that for the first time, the world is now tipped into 40% of our electricity is clean, right? And importantly as well, that clean electricity is displacing fossil in other sectors. So you're electrifying transport, really importantly. And that kind of idea that, all countries have to go through fossil dependency and that's the only way to develop, that's just been ripped apart. So everyone's now knows you can develop cleanly, more efficiently, faster, cheaper, and it's going to be clean for your citizens. So there's just this huge amount of literal energy being invested in and built in countries all over the world. And it's not like you could say, it's just in one place. It's now really widespread. And mostly that's to do with solar. But it's not just solar, it's also wind. It's also the fact that batteries have come down in price. So there is just this shift towards clean electricity that's happening on the ground, even in the US. So they put out a report on the US situation at the moment. Combined, wind and solar have now surpassed coal in the US in terms of volume of electricity. That's the first time since the beginning of electricity. So even in the US, you're seeing, because it's cheap and quick to build, it's growing. And you don't really need a lot of government support anymore for these technologies. They're so cheap.
And so I guess the question then becomes, for a lot of people who are watching the politics and the rhetoric play out, but maybe don't have as close a grounding like you and I have on what's going on in the ground, what would you say to them? Because some people are starting to kind of get worried and think, well, there really is a rollback.
Yeah, no, we should be worried. We should be vigilant, right? Because if you see this in terms of like a 100-year transition, it's never going to be completely smooth. It's never going to be like one straight path. There are going to be setbacks. It's going to be jagged. And, we're trying to displace an incumbent industry. Lots of people say, in 25 years, we revolutionized communications technologies. We've all got mobile phones. We didn't have those 20 years ago. But they were moving into a space where the incumbents were not as powerful. And we have very powerful incumbents across the fossil supply chain. And they are politically connected. And they're not going to kind of just say, okay, we'll go away. They're very happy with the status quo. And so you see this divide now between, Kingsville Bond is, I quote his words, we have petrostates whose really their future and their growth is tied with fossil. And then you have emerging electrostates, probably the most preeminent one being China, who don't have natural resources. They haven't got oil and gas reserves of their own. And they're like, okay, electricity is our vector of growth. So in the US, just joined the petrostate gang. It's always been there, really, but now they're much more overtly in that gang. And that gang is kind of Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US. What's the rest of the world going to do? Hopefully they're going to stand up to that and say, that might suit your business model and your geography, but for us, this form of abundant and distributed clean energy is the way we grow, and that's what we're going to do.
And so being vigilant, we're to be vigilant, but equally, perhaps like people shouldn't necessarily lose heart because of, as you're saying, the data.
Yeah.
The data that we're seeing that actually, this stuff is happening on the ground. But I love the way that you put it into perspective in terms of, this isn't just a quick turnaround, a switch. This is a transition.
Yeah.
And, do you see the kind of some of the fossil fuel supply chains actually starting to turn their hand to this new technology as well?
Yeah.
Are you seeing that in the US as well? Because we're certainly seeing that in the UK.
You will have seen it in Scotland, right?
Yeah.
The wonderful switch that all those service industries did from serving the oil and gas sector to serving the offshore wind industry. And that was almost like literal boats changing and deciding to serve a different customer. And in the US, the equivalent of that is people who do advanced drilling, switching from oil and gas and fracking of gas to geothermal. And before I came here, I was at San Francisco Climate Week at Geothermal House, where they are promoting this idea that, the Halliburtons of this world and the Schlumbergers, they have obviously been serving the oil and gas industry and making lots of money out of it. But if a new customer comes along and needs their technology, they will pivot into that. So it's kind of like sailors jumping ship and taking a new course, a more sustainable course. And so that's happening in Texas, the home of all of this innovation. So if it's happening there, then it'll spread from there.
So let's talk about some of this new technology. You've mentioned geothermal. Where do you see that going? Because of course the US is much less densely populated than the UK. They've got so much more space for this kind of stuff. Presumably there's a huge opportunity there in the US, and many of our viewers are based actually out there.
Yeah.
Where do you see it going, both there, but also in places like the UK, which are obviously much more densely populated and perhaps a bit more tricky?
Oh yeah, totally. And this is why geography and geology makes a huge difference in this transition of the politics, right? So yes, the US can do fracking in a way that no other country probably could because it's huge and there's no one living in most of it, and they have a kind of permissive environment where you can drill, especially in Texas. So geothermal in the US makes a lot of sense. Let's not, but I don't want to over-egg it because geothermal resources are tiny at the moment. They're not even on the map. What's happened is the drilling technology has allowed you to drill anywhere geothermal virtually, and everyone wants fun, clean. So those are the two vectors that are making it popular. Lots of money going in, lots of excitement, but it's still very early days. Whereas wind and solar has had 20 years of boosting, and it's now kind of in deployment stages around the world, especially solar and batteries. There's a whole range of technologies going to suit people's circumstances. But where does geothermal needed? Probably places like Indonesia, where Indonesia is a tricky country, hugely populated, but not a lot of land. Or if there is land, it's being used to produce food, or it's got forest on there, and they have almost no wind. Zero wind, and solar's hard. So geothermal there makes sense. They have geothermal resources, and drilling anywhere would work for them. So it's going to be positive for courses. And I would even say, famously, I'm quite pro-nuclear. And if you've got a densely populated, islanded nation, nuclear is a good option. You don't want to be in a tsunami risk zone, but you do have the benefit then of a very low footprint, very reliable, and self-sufficiency comes from that. So
let's talk about nuclear, because some people are saying that it is having a renaissance. The thing is we have heard that quite a few times before.
Yeah.
We'd love your perspective on that, given that you are known to be an advocate for it.
Yeah.
Where do you see it going now?
So it's really interesting that if you look back, the technology that broke through the fastest before wind and solar was nuclear. It had that really rapid uptake, mainly driven by France and then the US. But the UK was an innovator in the space. The UK has a really rich and storied history in nuclear, and we should be proud of that. So it has done a rapid scale up before. It's been choked back by people's fears mainly, and of course I don't want to do down the accidents that have happened, but they were industrial accidents that happened, and if you put it in the context of all industrial accidents ever, they weren't that big a deal, and we've learned from them. So the industry's moved on, and now we've got this swathe of new types of reactors that are starting almost with a blank sheet, with the help now of supercomputing and AI, and they're looking for the combination of cheap and safe. And we will get a new reactor come through. There are 900 papered reactor designs out there. The EPR, the European Pressurized Reactor that we all think of, that came from EDF, that's just one version of how to do nuclear. And it's like renewables. It's like many types. It's not monolithic. So some of these new smaller reactors or novel reactors, they could easily break through, become something that's manufactured rather than built, uniquely in a very slow process. And the safety concerns can be addressed through design. And so for that, and I mean, people say, what about the waste? But the waste is so small in comparison to the waste from fossil fuels, and it's containable. We know what to do with it. I think that's a solved argument. So yeah, it could come through.
What about the cost of it? Because I said, famously people always retort, well, actually, yes, Renaissance, yes, all of these new designs, but it costs an absolute fortune, and especially with new designs coming through, because you're not kind of, having a cookie cutter effect, the cost will still be high. I mean, do you see any changes in that coming through?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? But you've got to remember, if you're comparing nuclear with solar, it's like comparing a tricycle with a tractor. Like, they cost differently. Like, the nuclear is going to be around for maybe 80 years, depending on its design. In that time, you'll be recapitalizing your solar maybe 3 times, maybe 4 times. So, these are long-lived assets that endure. They're like infrastructure, and when you have them, you're going to be glad you've got them. So it's not the same as like, okay, I want something fast, I've got an immediate need. Like, solar is like, that's why solar is great, right? Because it's like an insect. It kind of reproduces fast, and it goes out into the landscape fast. These things are much more enduring and resilient, but they cost more. Now, also, some of the pricing of that is the cost of capital, right? Sometimes discount rates mean that you're having to pay more up front when you could maybe spread it out over longer. Or it'll be things like really, really expensive regulatory processes, which are still quite manual and slow. And so really what's interesting is, can we get better at regulating using some of these tools of AI and, or just becoming a little bit more can-do about it rather than can't-do. There was a period in which environmentalists actually worked out we could probably slow this down if we just layer on bureaucracy, and there's a lot of that happened. And I would say, needlessly, or not needlessly, but it's gone over the necessary levels. So yeah, I could talk about this for a long time, but I mean, you're right though. Countries who can afford to do it have to do it first and bring the cost down. And I think you'll see a combination of China and the US and the Middle East actually bringing reactors to be built, and we'll see what the cost reduction curve comes from that.